Night over the Pacific. A Japanese dive bomber drops out of the clouds like a falling star, engines screaming, aiming straight for an American carrier. The gunners open up, hundreds of shells, tracers slicing the sky. They miss. Every shot. The bomber keeps coming, closer, closer, until the gunners can see the pilot's goggles glinting in the moonlight. And then, one shell explodes several meters away. Not a hit. Not even close. But the bomber suddenly jolts, shudders, and rips apart mid-air as if struck by an invisible hammer. The crew stares in disbelief. How did a miss kill a plane? They don't know it yet, but inside that shell is a tiny glass bulb that will soon double AA kills, turn the tide of the Pacific, and save an entire fleet from extinction. By early 1943, the Pacific War had become a predictable nightmare. Every few days, a new swarm of Japanese bombers or torpedo planes rose from distant island airfields and came hunting for the U.S. Navy. The ocean was so vast that radar often caught them late, leaving the final defense to the gunners lining the decks. Young men staring down aircraft that moved faster and dove harder than anything they had trained for. The doctrine was simple and brutal. Put enough metal in the air and pray for a hit. But prayer wasn't winning the war. The reality was worse than anyone admitted. Anti-aircraft gunners fired thousands of shells to bring down a single plane. Direct hits were almost impossible at high speed. Dive bombers dropped vertically at 400 miles an hour. Torpedo planes skimmed the waves like angry shadows. Even when a shell struck close, it did nothing unless it hit perfectly. The fleet was losing ships faster than the shipyards could build them. Carriers, cruisers, destroyers, none of them felt safe. Every alarm sent sailors racing to stations with the terrible understanding that no matter how hard they fought, a single determined pilot could still sink them. Then something changed. It started quietly, without any announcement. Somewhere across the fleet, gunners began reporting the same bizarre detail. Aircraft were exploding even when the shells didn't hit. Close misses were suddenly becoming kills. Planes were falling out of the sky in numbers no one had ever seen before. The Navy hadn't gotten better. The enemy hadn't gotten worse. Something new had arrived on the battlefield. For years, anti-aircraft gunnery had been a problem everyone could describe but no one could solve. The flaw was baked into the physics. A ship's guns fired shells that armed themselves in flight and exploded only on contact, which meant the gunners had to do the impossible. Predict where a twisting, diving, accelerating aircraft would be several seconds in the future, fire at that invisible point, and hope the timing was perfect. If the shell missed by even a few feet, it was worthless. The fragments blew harmlessly into the air while the bomber roared past. Crews joked grimly that they weren't shooting at planes, they were painting the sky with disappointment. On paper, the Navy tried everything. Better fire control directors, faster calculations, radar-assisted aiming, but the hit rates barely improved. The problem wasn't the guns or the aim. The problem was the fuse itself. It required perfection in a place where perfection didn't exist. Dive bombers were closing at angles that no mechanical predictor could handle. Torpedo planes skimmed the waves, weaving deliberately to confuse tracers. Even veteran gunners with years of experience often froze as the enemy bore down on them. In the heat of combat, steady hands turned shaky, calculations dissolved under fear, and shells burst uselessly behind their targets. The men on the gun decks knew the truth long before the admirals did. They could fight bravely, but bravery didn't matter if the weapons couldn't keep up. Some ships fired so many shells that the deck became knee-deep in hot brass. Yet not a single bomber went down. When a Japanese plane did fall, it felt like luck, a rare, blessed moment in a sea of near misses. Every battle ended the same way, cheering when they survived, mourning when they didn't, and the sinking feeling that the next attack might be the one they couldn't stop. The Navy needed a miracle. Not a better gun, not a faster director, something entirely different. Something that didn't require hitting the plane at all. Somewhere, somehow, they needed a fuse that would explode near the target, automatically, intelligently, as if it could sense the plane itself. At the time, such an idea sounded like fantasy. No one realized it was already being built in secret, by scientists who were about to risk their careers, their reputations, and, ultimately, the fate of the fleet. The miracle the Navy needed began in a place that didn't look miraculous at all. A cramped set of basement laboratories at Johns Hopkins University, where the Applied Physics Laboratory had been formed almost overnight. Inside, a handful of scientists huddled over benches cluttered with glass tubes, copper coils, and battered oscilloscopes. Their mission sounded absurd even to them. Build a fuse that behaved like a miniature radar, small enough to fit into an artillery shell, tough enough to survive being fired from a gun, and smart enough to detonate when it came near an aircraft. It was a problem so ridiculous that most engineers refused to touch it. But the handful who remained were too stubborn, or too visionary, to walk away. The heart of the idea was a tiny glass tube, no bigger than a thumb. Inside it was a delicate radio oscillator, a filament so thin it could snap under its own weight, and a set of components that looked closer to radio hobbyist junk than military hardware. This fragile little bulb was supposed to withstand the shock of being fired from a cannon with more than 20,000 times the force of gravity. Navy officers who saw the early prototypes laughed outright. "You expect this thing to survive that?" one commander scoffed. "You'd have better luck firing eggs at the enemy." And at first, the officers were right. The early tests were catastrophic. Scientists fired shells packed with the new fuse, and the moment they left the barrel, the tubes shattered like Christmas ornaments. Every test ended the same way. A dull thud at the end of the range, and the humiliating sound of nothing exploding. Failure after failure piled up, each one more discouraging than the last. But these scientists were different. They weren't soldiers. They weren't bound by battlefield pragmatism. They were tinkerers, inventors, men who believed that even impossible ideas could work if you hit them with enough creativity. They experimented with shock absorbers, rubber mounts, vacuum sealing, and reinforced filaments. They redesigned the internal wiring again and again, searching for the one arrangement that would let the bulb survive a shell's brutal launch. Slowly, impossibly, the tests began to change. A few bulbs survived. Then more. A handful of shells detonated where the scientists predicted, not on impact, but in the air. They had glimpsed the future, but proving it in a lab was nothing compared to convincing the Navy to trust it in war. The breakthrough wasn't one moment, but a slow crawl out of failure. A few glass bulbs survived firing tests. A few shells detonated in midair. A few drone targets shuddered when fragments tore into them. Alone, each success meant nothing. But together, they formed a pattern no one could ignore. The scientists at the Applied Physics Laboratory realized they had crossed a line. Their fuse didn't just work in theory. It was ready to be born into reality. But reality had gatekeepers. When the Navy's inspection officers arrived for the official demonstration, they expected another disappointment. They stood with arms folded, faces stone hard, waiting to witness the latest in a long line of failed, miracle devices Washington kept throwing money at. The scientists, pale from weeks without sleep, loaded their test shells into a modified anti-aircraft gun. A drone plane buzzed into view across the blue Maryland sky. The gunner set his sights, pulled the lanyard, and the shell screamed upward. The officers leaned forward only out of obligation. Then it happened. The shell didn't hit the drone. It didn't even pass close. Instead, just as it approached, it detonated with a sharp, violent flash, far enough away that no contact fuse would have triggered, close enough that metal fragments ripped straight through the drone's wing. The aircraft spiraled downward, trailing smoke. The officers blinked. Some thought it was luck. Some suspected trickery. So the scientists fired again. Another mid-air detonation. Another shredded wing. Another kill. By the fifth drone, disbelief had turned to shock. The senior officer lowered his binoculars, stunned into silence. He understood immediately what the fleet had not yet realized. This wasn't a new fuse. This was a new era. A ship equipped with these shells wouldn't need pinpoint accuracy. it wouldn't need perfect timing. It only needed to shoot near the target, and the fuse would do the rest. But proving it in tests wasn't enough. The scientists needed approval to take their creation to war. That meant fighting through layers of bureaucracy, secrecy restrictions, and skeptical admirals who feared wasting precious space on unproven ammunition. The scientists pushed back with data. The officers pushed back with doubts. The future of the project hung in the balance. And then the order came down. The fuse was to be deployed in combat, under absolute secrecy. The fate of the Pacific would now rest on a glass bulb no bigger than a thumb. The crates arrived in the Pacific under armed guard, stamped with meaningless codes to conceal what was inside. Sailors offloaded them without ceremony, unaware that they were carrying one of the most classified pieces of technology in the entire Allied arsenal. Only the gunnery officers were briefed, and even they received a stripped-down explanation. These shells explode when they get close. Use them. Don't ask questions. And don't let a single one fall into enemy hands. When the gunners opened the crates, confusion spread instantly. Inside were shells with strange wiring, odd seams, and instructions printed in language so technical it may as well have been another alphabet. One sailor shook his head and muttered, "Looks like someone jammed a radio inside a bullet." Another snorted, "Feels like we're firing light bulbs." There was skepticism, laughter, and more than a little fear. Everyone had heard stories about experimental rounds blowing up barrels or misfiring at sea. But orders were orders. The fuse's first real test came on a humid afternoon somewhere east of Guadalcanal. A Japanese torpedo bomber appeared low on the horizon, skimming the waves. The alarm blared. Men sprinted to stations. The ship's guns swiveled, tracking the rapidly approaching threat. The gunnery chief hesitated for only a heartbeat, then barked, "Load the new ones!" The barrels boomed. The shells arced into the sky, small and fast, too fast for the naked eye to follow. The bomber kept coming, closing the distance, engine howling like an animal. The crew braced for impact. Then the air in front of the plane erupted. Not on the aircraft, not next to it, but close. Close enough that the explosion reached out like a metal storm. Fragments tore through the bomber's wing and cockpit. The plane jerked upward, rolled once, and smashed into the sea in a spray of white foam. Silence swept the deck. The gunners stared at each other, stunned. They hadn't hit the plane. They hadn't even come close enough to feel confident. Yet the bomber was gone, destroyed by something none of them fully understood. For the first time in months, the crew felt something unfamiliar. Hope. Because if this strange new fuse really worked, then maybe, just maybe, the fleet had a fighting chance. The reports started quietly at first, just a few lines in the daily action summaries. Target downed by near burst. AA unusually effective today. Multiple kills attributed to new fusing. But soon the trickle became a flood. Ships across the Pacific began experiencing something none of them had seen before. Their anti-aircraft guns were actually winning. At Leyte Gulf, a formation of Japanese dive bombers charged toward the escort carriers. In any other month of the war, the outcome would have been predictable. Several ships hit, at least one burning. But when the enemy began their steep dives, the American screens opened fire with proximity-fused shells. The sky lit up with bursts, not behind the planes, not beneath them, but around them, like invisible fists closing in from all directions. Bombers that would have survived ordinary flak were suddenly torn apart mid-dive, breaking into flaming fragments before they could release their payloads. Gun crews who had braced for the worst stood stunned as attack after attack simply dissolved. At Lingayen Gulf, kamikazes hurled themselves toward the fleet in terrifying waves. These pilots didn't care about evasive maneuvers. They didn't care about survival. They only cared about hitting something. And yet, even they couldn't break through the new wall of fire. Proximity rounds erupted all around them, sometimes 10, 20 yards off, and still the shockwaves ripped wings off, shattered cockpits, or flipped the aircraft sideways long enough for traditional gunners to finish the job. One destroyer escort downed 5 suicide planes in under 4 minutes. Old veterans said they had never witnessed anything like it. By the time the fleet approached Okinawa, the numbers were undeniable. Kill rates had doubled. In some units, they had tripled. Hours that once felt like certain death now felt survivable. Gunners began calling the new ammunition sky mines, because that's what it felt like. Planes were flying into invisible traps. Above all, the psychological shift was enormous. Men who had spent 2 years firing blindly into empty air now fired with confidence. The panic was still there. The kamikazes were still terrifying, but there was finally a weapon that could match them. The Navy hadn't just improved its defenses, it had rewritten the rules of aerial warfare. By the spring of 1945, the Pacific had become a battlefield built on desperation. The Japanese air forces, battered but still deadly, threw everything they had into kamikaze operations. For the Americans, every sunrise carried the same dread question: which ship will burn today? But when the proximity fuse fully reached the front line, that question slowly began to lose its power. One of the clearest turning points came during the approach to Okinawa, aboard a destroyer that had already survived 2 major engagements. Before the new fuses arrived, her crew had lived through endless close calls, bombs that missed by yards, suicide planes that splashed just short of the hull, shockwaves that rattled teeth. But on this morning, when radar spotted incoming bogies racing over the waves, the ship was ready in a way it had never been before. A formation of kamikazes appeared through the haze, flying so low their propellers churned up mist from the ocean's surface. The crew braced themselves. In older battles, this was the moment when a ship's fate often felt sealed. Too many targets, too little time. But not today. The gunnery officer shouted for the new shells. The first volley soared upward. No one expected miracles. But as the kamikazes closed to within a few thousand yards, the sky began erupting around them. Bursts of fire filled the air, sharp, precise detonations that seemed almost intelligent. One plane flew through a cloud of fragments and simply unraveled. Another lost a wing mid-turn. A third pitched violently and slammed into the sea long before reaching the ship. The men on deck watched in disbelief as the suicidal charge collapsed, not from lucky hits, but from a defensive wall so dense and lethal, it looked unnatural. The kamikazes kept coming. They were fearless, relentless, almost impossible to deter. But the intercept zone surrounding the destroyer had changed. It was no longer a gap to be exploited. It was a killing field. Even when a few planes pushed deeper, the proximity fuses bought precious seconds. Seconds for the gunners to track. Seconds for the ship to maneuver. Seconds that meant everything. By the end of the attack, the destroyer was still afloat, untouched. Smoke drifted across the sea from the wreckage of 6 downed aircraft. For the crew, the emotion was overwhelming. Relief, disbelief, and something dangerously close to gratitude for a technology they barely understood. They didn't talk about luck anymore. They didn't talk about fate. They talked about the fuse. The tiny glass bulb that had turned a destroyer from a target into a fortress. Success in the Pacific brought a new, uncomfortable problem. The fuse was too good. Admirals were ecstatic, gunners were confident, and ships that should have been lost were coming home in one piece. But in London, Winston Churchill read the same classified reports with a tightening jaw. He understood something most never considered. If a single dud round landed intact on German soil, the enemy would gain the most advanced fuse in the world. And German scientists, among the best anywhere, would copy it in weeks. They would put it in their own flak shells. Allied bombers would start falling out of the sky in horrifying numbers. The offensive over Europe could collapse completely. So Churchill issued one of the strictest wartime orders on record. The proximity fuse must never, under any circumstances, be used over land in Europe. Not a single unit, not a single test, not a single shell. It was a terrifying paradox. America's most powerful defensive weapon was considered too dangerous to deploy where it was arguably needed most. This secrecy created tension between theaters. Pacific commanders begged for more fuses, insisting they needed them to survive kamikaze season. European commanders begged for any of them, pointing at the growing casualties of daylight bombing. Washington refused every request. The risk was simply too great. The fuse was the Allies' trump card, and if it slipped into enemy hands, everything, from the invasion of France to the bomber offensive, could be endangered. For months, the rule held. The fuse was locked to the Pacific like a chained dragon. And then, the V-1 rockets began falling on London. Dozens a day, sometimes hundreds. The world's first cruise missiles, buzzing like mechanical hornets, too fast for guns to hit cleanly, and too erratic for traditional fuses. Suddenly, the secrecy had a cost measured in civilian lives. Churchill had to make a decision: hold the line on secrecy, or unleash the weapon that might finally stop the V-1s before they reached his people. Churchill didn't hesitate long. London was shaking every night, streets torn open by fire and shrapnel, families sleeping in tunnels, children waking to the sound of sirens and the rising whine of approaching engines. The V-1s were terrifying because they didn't attack like planes. They simply appeared overhead and exploded without warning. Fighter interceptors tried to catch them, but they were too fast. Anti-aircraft guns tried to hit them, but they were too small. If the war had a moment when civilians felt truly helpless, it was during the V-1 campaign. So Churchill lifted the ban, quietly, secretly, under the cover of darkness. The first proximity-fused shells arrived at AA batteries ringing London. The gunners were shocked. Most had heard rumors of the miracle fuse used in the Pacific, but none expected to touch one themselves. They loaded the shells carefully, as if handling live animals. The officers reminded every crew: if one round falls unexploded into enemy territory, the consequences could be catastrophic. Then the first V-1 came over. The guns opened up. The shells burst. Not close, not nearly, but perfectly, surrounding the missile in an invisible sphere of metal. The V-1 disintegrated midair. No dive, no crater, no warning. Just gone. The gunners stared at each other. They'd never seen anything like it. Within days, kill rates soared. Batteries that once struggled to land a single hit were suddenly knocking V-1s down in clusters. Entire salvos of rockets were being destroyed before reaching London. For the first time since the attacks began, the city breathed again. The secret was safe, and the weapon had proven itself in both theaters of war. Long after the conflict ended, engineers would study the fuse and call it the grandfather of all smart weapons. Naval historians would call it one of the top 3 inventions of the entire Allied effort. But the sailors and gunners who lived through those battles remembered it more simply. A tiny glass bulb, a piece of fragile electronics fired into a storm of steel and fire, and the invention that saved ships, cities, and thousands of lives. The proximity fuse didn't just change the war. It changed what human beings believed was possible. When the war finally ended, the sailors and gunners went home, but the memory of those strange new shells never left them. They had fought battles no one thought survivable, and lived because their guns suddenly began hitting what they had always missed. Only later did many learn the truth, that inside every one of those shells was a fragile glass bulb, no larger than a thumb, born in a basement lab by scientists who refused to accept impossible odds. Historians now call the proximity fuse one of the 3 inventions that saved the Allied navies. Engineers call it the ancestor of every smart weapon that came after. But the men on the gun decks remembered it more simply. The moment the sky stopped being a death sentence and started being something they could fight. A tiny spark of innovation had kept an entire fleet alive, and it changed the war forever.